The Watchful Eyes. When Emily moved into her new apartment, it was supposed to be a fresh start. She had left behind a toxic relationship, a dead-end job, and the crushing weight of a past she'd rather forget. The apartment was small but charming, tucked away on a quiet street lined with old oak trees. The walls were painted a soft, calming blue, and the hardwood floors gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. It felt like a place where she could finally breathe, where she could rebuild herself. The first thing she did was unpack her camera. Photography had always been her passion, the one thing that could ground her when life became too overwhelming. She spent that first day capturing the light as it streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor and the way the leaves outside danced in the breeze. The apartment, with its quaint charm and quiet stillness, seemed like a place where she could create something beautiful. But as the days passed, Emily began to notice something odd. Whenever she reviewed the photos she had taken, she saw something that shouldn't be there: eyes. Not just the natural reflection of light in the lens, but distinct, human eyes. They appeared in the shadows, in the corners of the frames, watching her. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, a trick of the light, or maybe a smudge on the lens. But no matter how carefully she cleaned her camera, the eyes continued to appear. The more she looked at the photos, the more unsettled she became. The eyes were always different, sometimes wide and curious, other times narrow and malevolent. They were not the same set of eyes repeated, but dozens, if not hundreds, of different pairs. It was as if she was being watched by a crowd, their silent gazes following her every move. Emily tried to rationalize it. Perhaps there was a logical explanation, an issue with the camera's sensor, a reflection she hadn't accounted for. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. The eyes felt too real, too deliberate. And they weren't just in her photos anymore. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Emily collapsed onto her couch, her camera resting on the coffee table in front of her. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small lamp in the corner. She was about to doze off when she felt it, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, as if someone was watching her. Her heart began to race as she slowly turned her head, scanning the room for any sign of movement. But there was nothing there. The apartment was empty, just as it had been moments before. She shook her head, trying to dispel the feeling. It was just paranoia, she told herself. Nothing more. But as she reached for her camera, intending to distract herself by reviewing the photos she had taken earlier that day, something caught her eye. There, on the screen of the camera, was a photo she didn't remember taking. It was of her, sitting on the couch, in the exact position she was in now. And in the shadows behind her, barely visible, was a pair of eyes. Emily's blood ran cold. The photo wasn't just an image, it was a reflection of the present moment, capturing her as she sat there, alone in her apartment. She hadn't taken it, hadn't even pressed the shutter. Yet there it was, a perfect snapshot of her fear, with those watchful eyes lurking in the background. Panic set in as she dropped the camera onto the floor, scrambling to her feet. She spun around, half expecting to find someone standing behind her, but the room was empty. The shadows seemed to stretch and warp, distorting the familiar shapes of her furniture into something menacing and unfamiliar. Breathing heavily, Emily backed away from the couch, her mind racing. She needed to leave, to get out of the apartment before whatever was happening became worse. But as she reached for her keys on the counter, The room plunged into darkness. The light bulb in the lamp flickered once, twice, and then died, leaving her in the pitch black. She fumbled for her phone, the small glow of the screen providing a sliver of comfort in the oppressive darkness. She dialed a friend's number, her fingers trembling, but before she could press call, the phone slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor. The room was silent, the only sound the rapid beating of her heart. She bent down, feeling along the floor for her phone, but as her fingers brushed against the cold surface, she heard it, a soft whisper, like the rustle of fabric or the murmur of a distant conversation. It was coming from behind her. Emily froze, her hand hovering over the phone. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, but she couldn't make out the words. It was as if multiple voices were speaking at once, overlapping and intertwining in a cacophony of sound. She didn't dare turn around, afraid of what she might see. Suddenly, the whisper stopped, replaced by a sharp, high-pitched laugh. It echoed through the apartment, sending shivers down her spine. She grabbed her phone, bolting upright and stumbling towards the door. But as she reached for the handle, she realized with a growing sense of dread that she couldn't move it. The door was locked, the keyhole jammed, as if someone or something was holding it shut from the other side. She was trapped. Emily backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the room. The darkness seemed to press in on her, suffocating her, and the whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. They were coming from all around her, filling the room with a sense of malice that made her skin crawl. Desperate, she turned towards the windows, hoping to escape that way. But as she approached, she saw her reflection in the glass and the eyes. They were there, in the reflection, surrounding her, watching her. Hundreds of them, all fixated on her with a chilling intensity. Emily screamed, turning away from the windows and stumbling back into the center of the room. The eyes were everywhere now, appearing in the mirrors, in the reflection of the TV screen, even in the polished surface of the coffee table. She was surrounded, no matter where she looked. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the laughter echoed in her ears. She felt a cold breeze brush past her, though the windows were closed. It carried with it the scent of decay, of something old and rotten. "Who are you?" she cried out, her voice shaking with fear. "What do you want from me?" But the whispers only intensified, growing into a roar that filled her mind, drowning out her thoughts. She clutched her head, trying to block out the noise, but it was inside her, invading her very being. Then, in an instant, the noise stopped. The room was deathly silent, the oppressive darkness lifting slightly. Emily looked around, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The eyes were gone, the whispers silenced. But she was not alone. Standing in the center of the room, where the shadows had been darkest, was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its form barely distinguishable in the dim light. Its face was a blur of shadows, but the eyes, those terrible eyes, were unmistakable. They glowed with an unnatural light, piercing through the darkness to lock onto her. Emily's blood turned to ice as the figure took a step towards her. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. She wanted to run, to scream, but her body refused to obey. She was frozen in place, trapped by those unyielding eyes. The figure reached out, its hand extending towards her, and she could feel the chill emanating from it. It was like the very essence of death, cold and unrelenting. As the hand drew closer, Emily felt her strength leave her. The world around her began to fade, the darkness closing in once more. She knew, in that moment, that there was no escape. The eyes had been watching her all along, waiting for the right moment to claim her. And now, they had her. The last thing Emily saw before the darkness consumed her completely was the figure's hand closing around her throat, its grip like iron. The eyes glowed brighter, filling her vision, burning into her soul. Then, there was nothing but blackness. When the police found Emily's apartment 3 days later, they were baffled by what they saw. The place was in disarray, as if someone had left in a hurry. But there was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone had come in or out. The only clue they found was Emily's camera, lying in the center of the room, its screen cracked but still functional. One of the officers, out of curiosity, decided to review the photos on the camera. The last image taken was of Emily, her face twisted in terror, her eyes wide with fear. And in the background, barely visible in the shadows, was a pair of glowing eyes. They never found Emily, but sometimes, in the dead of night, when the moon is full and the air is still, the neighbors say they can hear whispers coming from the apartment. And if you stand outside and look up at the windows, you might catch a glimpse of something watching you from the darkness, something with eyes that never blink, never look away. And if you're not careful, those eyes might follow you home.